Hello and welcome to this video on Sump Pump by Robots Are Red, an expressive and powerful dynamics manager for noise gating, compression and expansion. Here's what's to come in the video. This video is sponsored by Robots Are Red, and this video is part of our free patches series, but instead of just doing free patches here, we've got kind of three umbrella concepts that we'll explore, which is compression and different ways to use that within a modular system, noise gating, including a really creative idea from Brian at Robots Are Red, and then we'll look at sidechain ducking with big pumping bass that's good fun, but also more kind of creative and possibly more interesting kind of ambient effects ducking exploration too. So exploring the controls, Sump Pump is 6 HP. We have a switch for noise gate or compression like behavior, stereo in, stereo out, and we work from this threshold control. When your audio crosses that threshold, in this case to be noise gated, it reduces that level down to the floor control. And that floor can be 0 dB, so no change at 3 o'clock there. And then you can reduce down quite subtly, or you can go all the way down to minus infinity, which is minus 100 dB, so extreme and effectively off, it's silent. And in terms of getting down to that floor, you've got the attack and release controls to set up that timing and behavior. In the compression mode, rather than having a ratio control, it still uses that floor to set from when that threshold is crossed, what level do you get down to. There's also an additional output level control, which is handy just for setting things up in your system. There's a gate input to engage the effect, CV inputs for the threshold and floor controls, that duck input to sidechain duck this like an inverting VCA. You can patch audio, triggers, envelopes into this. And you also get an envelope output that follows that gating or compression behavior, allowing you to then patch that creatively around the rest of a system. And on that floor control, there's actually 10 dB of additional level. So if you think of this hitting the threshold and compressing down to a lower level, you can actually get that to go up, working more like an expander than a compressor. All the patches are on screen now, so skip around as you like. Those are links down in the video description. And without further ado, let's dive in. So for this first of 3 set of examples here, we're going to look at compression. I'm in the comp mode. However, my threshold's up full, I'm not doing any compressing. And with any kind of drums and percussion, it's quite an obvious example for compression, although we'll do more than just drum beats in the video. But this is my dry drum beat. Now I have the floor all the way down, so when this does kick in, it's going to go all the way down to 0 here, or off if you like, rather than 0 dB. And as I lower the threshold, there's some activity. Now this is really aggressive because I have the attack and release as fast as they'll go. If I start to add some attack, we'll get a smoother kind of entry into that reduction in level that compression offers. And you can kind of dial in the amount of punch on that kick drum. And then that kind of clicking, because we don't have any release, as soon as it releases from activity, it just instantly jumps up in level. So we'll add a bit of release as well here. Now to stop this being so aggressive, we could raise the threshold. And listen to that distortion in the kick drum now. If you can hear the low end. If you can hear the low end clearly, listen to the difference. And we've got this vroom, this kind of suck and reshaping of that kick. But you can also play around with the floor here. If I raise the floor, what happens when it detects activity is it goes down to that floor level. If I flick this into gate, turn the floor down, this is all the bits that the compressor is compressing. So as I go back to comp, we have that inverted behavior. And you can keep playing around with threshold and the floor and those attack and release times to suit the material. So even sounds that are just kind of thick walls of tone can be played around with compression. And here I have this sound that's dry. It's quite a tasty audio chain, which is a super saw into a phaser, into a load of distortion, into a filter, into some small ping pong delay and room effects. And you can hear that, well, there's some tonal change in there, largely with the filter and LFO to the phasing, and some envelope to distortion in Headbanger here. It's pretty much just a dense wall of sound already. But through Sump Pump here, I'm actually using it like an expander. If I turn the floor down, it's finding changes in level there, clamping down on them with an inverted version of this envelope that's red that you can see here. But by raising the floor, rather than letting it compress down, it's going to boost up in these gaps. We've added this extra life and movement. If I go between the two, and I've tried to kind of level match at least a little bit. This is dry, not through Sump Pump. That stereo width, those effects changes. We're getting this push and pull and this swells. It's extra body in the sound. I have a kick drum, just for a bit of fun. And if you like this patch and want a full patch breakdown of the whole thing, I'll do that over on patreon.com/DivKid. It's just a quick example to say you can still smash already thick walls of synth distortion and create interesting pumps and textures and kind of a shape change with a compressor. So here's a kind of mixed electromechanical keyboard and piano loop I made a while ago. May have even used it in some other videos. But I'm using it here to show how you can reshape the dynamics of other things, not just drums. And if I bring the floor here around to 3 o'clock, the floor is effectively 0 dB, so there's no change. And you can hear my key sound. Let's bring the floor all the way down here. You can hear as these notes stack, it clamps down quite heavily, well, really heavily, because we have a silent floor. And we can really hear that attack and release. Let's increase them even more. With them very quick, very instant. It's of course very instant. We've crossed the threshold with no attack and no release. It's slamming down to our floor. In this case is off. Bringing up the floor. Let's add some attack time and release. And bringing that floor up further, we can add this nice heavy compression, but heavy reshaping of this sound. So here I was just going to show you a simple use for a noise gate, which typically in a studio is gating away, removing, say, some background noise or some undesirable sound that's left over between the main notes in whatever your audio is. But who'd have thought modulating a noise gate would be cool? Robots I Read did, and I'm glad they did. I'm having fun here playing around with the floor of the noise gate, pushing and pulling in and out of noise, snapping away at some sounds, letting others bloom, and using that envelope out here to fade in my effects as well. Now let's remove the modulation and effects, come back to them. Here's your kind of standard use for a noise gate. If I bring the floor up to 0, you can see all of my sound here other than my sequencing. It's a sine wave out of an analog oscillator into a low pass gate, into loads of distortion. I've deliberately made the headbanger as noisy as I can here, with distortion and gain up full. And you can hear there's just lots of noise. There's tons of gain, tons of distortion, a little bit of feedback. And typically a noise gate will be used to remove that. So by turning the floor of the noise gate all the way down, we can open the gate on the louder parts, the bits we want, and turn the floor right down for the ones we don't. And you can use attack and release to control that behaviour, how it fades in and fades out. Playing around with threshold here. And you could use that floor to not go all the way to 0, be less aggressive, but just remove some of the noise and tail of that sound. Now let's leave it all the way down. I quite like this aggressive noise gating in this instance. The envelope out here I'm using to fade in a VCA with effects, taking a split in a stacking cable of this sound before Sump Pump to my effects. And I'm using the envelope to fade in that level in the mixer. So when I play this sound, the effect should fade up in between. It's a quite nice interplay with aggressive, dry gating, and then this bloom and pushing out of the way in the wet sound. Now playing around with modulating this floor, I'll remove the effects to do that. I have a step sequence here from my pattern generator. Let's patch that into floor. So we're pushing that floor up, even boosting the noise now, because the floor is higher than 0 dB. Boosting the noise on some steps, cutting them down on others. So as we bring those effects in, we've got, to me, what feels like a creative pushing and pulling, aggressive gating and dynamic shaping, some creative effects control. So you can use Sump Pump to just remove noise in noisy audio sources or from, say, noisy modules, but you can do much more with it too. So here's a really cool idea from Brian at Robots I Read, and it's something he's been doing live and telling me this idea. I wanted to recreate it for you here, and that's using the noise gate and the floor control to play around with the kind of density and complexity of a beat. How many of those kind of quiet in-between sounds between the main kind of kick and snare are coming through a patch. And I'm modulating and playing around with that here. Let's remove the synth sounds, my modulation, and just listen to my beat. So here you can hear a mono in, mono out, noise gated beat. If I bring the floor up to 0, you can hear I've got little bits of noise percussion, filtered breakbeats, some resonant filter things going on in the background. It's a very dense and dynamic beat with that main kick and snare, the break, and all those other extra elements. But in the noise gate here, only those louder elements are going to come through as I start reducing the level and letting this noise gate the beat. So I'll slowly reduce the floor and listen how the beat just kind of drops back other than those main hits, ultimately to nothing when I turn it all the way down. I think it's a really unique approach and effect, something that you can be creative with. This is obviously really extreme gating, it's going to be quite obvious what you're doing, but going from the full beat to just reducing those quieter bits slightly, certainly when there's other sounds going on, you play around with those punchy hits. I think it's really interesting. Now we do have some modulation that I'll add and then remove again, and this is modulating the floor control. And over 4 bars, this starts with that floor really low, comes up and then comes down again. We'll play around with that later. So my other parts here in this patch is my main bass line and some effects. Now I'm using the envelope out here, and that's this green trace on the scope to make my low pass gates swell in. If I make it more extreme, you can hear those swells in between the main plugs. And that same envelope's being used for my effects. You can hear this stereo growth and snap back down again. And that's the envelope from the noise gate over the drums. So when it's all playing, got some nice interactivity between the gating of the beat and the synth sounds. And while this is playing, if I reduce this floor, let's kind of decrease the complexity in the beat. Let's add that modulation back in. Taking us from more extreme gated beat through bringing up all those in between quieter elements and snapping them back again. So I've really just made this whole patch to say that you can duck and sidechain, but you can be way more creative and interesting than this patch. Now intense just pumping in a kind of techno dance setting is really obvious use for sidechain compression, and it's what we're doing here. So let's run through that first before we do something I think a bit more creative and interesting, but just getting lost in a good 4 to the floor pump. It is good fun. So outside of Sump Pump, here's my beat. Let's mute those bits for now. I'll remove the actual sidechain ducking here. And I have a stereo synth sound. There's a PWM pulse, or pulse with modulation, into stereo filtering, into stereo effects, and that's the input here to Sump Pump. Now you can duck with kind of anything in here. I'm just putting my trigger in my gate signal that is triggering my quarter note kick drum or 4 to the floor kick. I'm patching a copy in here. You notice we just get this aggressive pumping straight away. And this works either in gate mode or comp mode. I'm in comp mode here, but as I go to gate, get the same behaviour. And then you could be gating or compressing kind of on top of that. You can hear it's just got that intense ducking, perfect to pretend with some kind of Benny Benassi video or something. So here we're using that duck input for side chaining, I think in a more creative, possibly more interesting way than just going heavy-handed pumping bass, as good fun as that is. And the technique here is to split your dry sound and your big wet effects, big bombastic over-the-top stereo effects that would otherwise be in the way of the mix, and to duck them when your dry notes play, creating this intense pumping that just gets the effects out of the way so your sounds can play. So removing the effects for a second, this is rings. I'm playing with brightness and the dampening, the length. And then I have some big over-the-top effects. Let's remove any ducking here. Just 2 delays and a reverb. And by taking a copy of the dry sound, or rather an envelope that's triggered when the dry sound plays, I can play around with ducking. You can just hear this brief duck. We can play around with the level. Some actual ducking here. Let's make some bigger, brighter sounds. This is fully wet. I'm triggering an envelope that's coming into a VCA, like an attenuator, and turning that up full. We can play around with the envelope shape. Into that duck input, like we did in the last patch, either in gate or compression mode. So you can be more subtle with lower level envelopes in this case, or more aggressive, letting that full envelope signal come through. And in those just instant kind of clicky ducks that we've created, that's where these dry notes live. So you can set up a level of ducking with loads of effects, loads of delay, loads of reverb. We've still got that clarity and that kind of transient hit from the dry sound as we're ducking the wet sound out of the way, just briefly and right on those notes playing. And it's really lovely use of some stereo compression or gating, ducking in this case, sidechain compression. If you've got this far in the video, drop a Sump sync down in the comments. How are you using compression and noise gating in your modular or outside your modular systems? Let us know and let's discuss that down in the comments. Head to patreon.com/DivKid for a bonus video exclusive to supporters there with Sump Pump and lots of other exclusives. You can join the DivKid Discord community there too. Thanks for watching and we'll see you next time. Bye!